It's a great privilege this evening to have with us Professor Martin Nowak, who is Professor of Biology and Mathematics at Harvard University and Director of Harvard's Program for Evolutionary Dynamics. Professor Nowak works on the mathematical description of evolutionary processes, including the evolution of cooperation and human language, and the dynamics of virus infections and human cancer. He's done a great deal of work, for example, on the mechanisms of HIV disease transmission and of drug resistance to HIV and the effects of that. He is Austrian by birth. He comes from Vienna, has studied at the University of Vienna and at Oxford, and of course, after a long career, he is now at Harvard. He is the author of some 300 academic papers. He wrote a book called Evolutionary Dynamics in the year 2006, and a more recent volume, Super Cooperators, and you should see that on the bookstall outside. He's a recipient of numerous prizes, which I just will not list. Quite recently, he published a paper in Nature with E.O. Wilson and Corina Tarnita, which attacked the mathematics of Hamilton's rule, this well-known explanation for kin selection. And that's attracted a good deal of discussion, and I think we shall hear some enlightenment on that during this particular lecture. And it's a great joy to be able to share this with the Symposium on Evolution, Cooperation and Ethics, funded by the MacDonald Foundation. And that meeting is being chaired by Professor Sarah Coakley, who's here from the Divinity Faculty here in Cambridge. If it's not too unfortunate a biological metaphor, perhaps we're killing two birds with one stone by being able to join forces, as it were. Now, the group from the MacDonald Foundation Symposium will have to leave pretty promptly, I'm afraid, after the lecture. We will have a bit of time for questions, but rather limited, and then Professor Nowak and the others will have to leave. But there will be drinks and a bookstall outside for all the rest of us to enjoy for some considerable time afterwards. So it's a great privilege, Professor Nowak.
Welcome. It's a great joy and honor for me to be here. I spent 9 years at Oxford, and whenever I visited Cambridge, I was very intimidated when I thought about the tremendous contributions that Cambridge has made and is making to science. And I remember this one breakfast I had with my mentor, then Robert May, who later Lord May of Oxford and President of the Royal Society, in Trinity College, actually. We had breakfast there, and I looked around and I said to him, "Aren't you intimidated by this greatness?" And he said, "No, he's just feeling among his own. This is his." But my admiration for Cambridge actually hasn't been modified at all. I'm coming from the new Cambridge to the real Cambridge. I want to apologize to my friends who have heard all my jokes before, but I still cannot resist to actually saying them. So I'm a mathematical biologist, and you might wonder what that is. There was a time when people did wonder what that was. So it's the following. There's a shepherd and a flock of sheep. And a man comes by and says, "If I guess the correct number of sheep in your flock, can I have one?" And the shepherd says, "All right, try." So the man looks and says, 83. And the shepherd is completely amazed. The man picks up a sheep and wants to walk away. The shepherd says, "Hang on, if I guess your profession, can I have my sheep back?" "Please try." "You must be a mathematical biologist." "How did you know?" "Because you picked up my dog." So in our field, it is important to get the numbers right, and today I hope that we will get the numbers right on this question of evolution of cooperation. And here we already see 3 instances of cooperation. The one is among cells that form filaments, such as cyanobacteria, and every so often a cell dies, the big black ones there, dies in order to fix nitrogen and feed the others with nitrogen. So it's a kind of cooperative act. And many biologists would say altruistic act among cells, where a cell gives its life to feed the others. Then we have cooperation among insects, where you see, for example, ants here raising the offspring of another individual. And you would ask, how does natural selection design an individual so it would actually not reproduce itself, but have somebody else reproduce it? And a very recent example, a painting of Vincent van Gogh of the Good Samaritan, the episode that is described in the New Testament 2000 years ago. So human cooperation. I always like to begin at the beginning, and there are very few dates that are truly remarkable and that all of us should always kind of know. And I begin by asking my friends, the physicists, and I ask them, so how old is the universe? And they tell me 13.7 billion years. And there's very little doubt, and they tell me they are so certain about this number because they can do it calculation 3 different ways, and they all give the same answer. So this is when the Big Bang is thought to have happened. Then I ask them, how old is our solar system? And they look at me and say 4.567 billion years. That's the age of the sun. And even more amazingly, they can calculate with radiotopic decay, they can calculate also when was the last supernova that gave rise to the heavy elements that are in us, just a few million years before this. Then Earth is a bit younger than Sun. As you know, Earth was hit by another planet early on that gave rise to the Moon and so on. So physicists know their dates with great precision. Now we come to biology, and now we're no longer so certain. So when was the origin of life, if there was an origin of life on Earth? People don't really know how to answer that question. The answer that can be given is 3.5 billion years ago, there's chemical evidence for life on Earth. So we don't really have fossils, we just have the traces of a chemistry that suggests living systems, 3.5 billion years ago. 2.1 billion years ago, now we have bacterial fossils, and the amazing thing, they are already in a simple sense multicellular, as I showed you in the very beginning on the very left side of my slide. So bacterial fossils 2.1 billion years old, a eukarya, so higher cells 1.8 billion years old, 600 million years complex multicellularity. So now we invent things like the nervous system, the immune system, so you come into the domain of animals, of plants, of fungi, a major transition in evolution, as John Maynard Smith would have called it. 120 million years ago, insect societies, and a few million years ago, human language. And I think these were the great events that we are actually seeing in evolution. And human language is remarkable in the sense that it gives rise to a new mode of evolution. Because evolution is about the transfer of information. And with human language, you can transfer non-genetic information between individuals, and that enables a kind of evolution that happens in addition to the genetic evolution. And that is responsible for the enormous adaptation and the speed of adaptation of the human species. But because we don't rely on genetic evolution, we can actually work with cultural evolution. One person has an idea, and the others can learn this idea. And what I find so interesting about cooperation is, and this was also pointed out in John Maynard Smith's book, cooperation is kind of needed for this kind of construction. When evolution moves to a higher level of organization, this happens because there is a closer and closer cooperation between the units on the lower level. Maynard Smith didn't actually offer mathematical theory for this construction, and there hasn't actually been much in this direction, but this is one of the reasons why cooperation is so interesting in biology. I will come back to that point. Who knows that photo? So this is the thinking path of Charles Darwin, where he walked back and forth, thinking great thoughts of evolution. And here is a photo of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who are actually co-discoverers of evolution. Because Wallace independently came to the same conclusion and wrote a short paper that he submitted to Darwin, because Wallace was in Singapore, I think, at the time, submitted it to Darwin and said, if you think anything about this paper, would you be so kind as to send it to a journal for publication on my behalf? Which is a very interesting idea, that you send your major discovery to your competitor and ask his competitor to forward it if he thinks it's proper. What I find also remarkable is that both of them had the decisive idea after reading Malthus. Malthus with the idea that exponentially growing populations will run out of resources, and this running out of resources will lead to a terrible scenario of natural selection. That gave this idea here. And the amazing thing is that macroeconomists have recently told me the surprising thing is that Malthus is discounted in macroeconomic theory, because economists so far have never run out of resources. Whenever somebody runs out of resources, there's even more incentive to come up with a new invention that sort of remedies this. They haven't seen this in macroeconomics. And we know it is the dominant force in biology. I think ultimately we will run out of resources. When Darwin died, there were two major objections to his theory. And there is some possibility where you could say there's a third one, but it wasn't formulated as precisely. Darwin did not know how to respond to the first two major objections. And the first one was the age of the sun. The most important physicist at the time, Lord Kelvin, had calculated the age of the sun to be 200,000 years. And Darwin didn't know whether that was enough for the kind of evolution he envisaged. But he couldn't respond to this statement. Of course, the calculation of the physicist was wrong, because at that time they didn't know about the nuclear fusion that was actually fueling the sun, as opposed to just chemical oxidation processes. So the age of the sun was actually greatly underestimated at that time. Very interestingly, the second major objection was also of a kind of mathematical nature. It was pointed out by a British engineer, and this was that Darwin had actually described blending inheritance as opposed to particulate inheritance, because he didn't know Mendelian genetics. So he thought that two parents sort of height, they would have children of the average height, so it would blend. And then the engineer pointed out, if it's always blending, after some time everybody has the average height, the average size, and there's no further variation upon which natural selection could act. And that answer was actually given only by the integration between Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolution that was offered by the birth of population genetics in the new synthesis. So it was a mathematical analysis that actually explained if you have discrete inheritance, as in Mendelian genetics, together with simple population genetics, you maintain genetic variation. This is the famous Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Hardy, a Cambridge mathematician who was very proud not to contribute anything practical ever in his life, made actually the most practical comment to evolution. And then the last one you could say in this Darwinism, is there any place for cooperation? Is there actually any possibility left that individuals who in the competition of natural selection would have any incentive to help each other? So Darwin did discuss this property of worker bees. Why would natural selection equip an individual so perfectly in order to just raise the offspring of somebody else? He also said, I think, if somebody finds a trait in a species that is there solely for the good of another species, that would discount my theory. So before we go into this, I want to ask the question, what evolves? What is it that evolves? And it was brilliantly put by Ernst Mayr, a Harvard biologist who died, who lived more than 100 years actually of age. And in this book, What Evolution Is, he asks this question. Loosely speaking, we talk about evolution of species. We talk about evolution of genes, the evolution of the brain. None of these things actually evolve. The only thing that evolves are populations. So the carrier of the evolutionary process is a population of reproducing individuals. If you have a population of reproducing individuals, you have an evolutionary process. And inaccurate reproduction, so a mistake during reproduction, leads to mutation. You have a new type, and then if different types have different growth rates, there's a chance for selection. So the fundamental ingredients of the evolutionary process, once we have populations, are mutation and selection. And these are the classical forces of evolutionary dynamics, and to this I wish to add cooperation, because I wish to argue without cooperation you do not actually get construction. So in the fundamental equations of evolution, I do not see the propensity to construct higher levels of organization. But with cooperation, you actually make that step to actually produce units that are intimately linked to give rise to a higher unit of organization. So for example, the emergence of the first cell. or the emergence of multicellular organisms. And interestingly, cancer is a breakdown of cooperation among cells when cells get mutation that revert them back to the primitive phenotype of just replication, destroying the organism. So what is cooperation? And this is not the most precise definition that I could give, but it's maybe a good working definition for the purpose of this talk. It's something that gets you far in the context of this talk, but there is a more precise way to do it. But one form of cooperation is there's an interaction between two individuals, cells or people. There's a donor, and the donor pays a cost, and the recipient gets a benefit. And cost and benefit are measured in terms of fitness, and reproduction can be genetic or cultural. And that now leads to the following very simple game in the context of game theory, which is called the prisoner's dilemma. So if we both have now the option to be donor, then if I cooperate and you cooperate, your payoff is B minus C, because you have the benefit from my cooperation, but you have to pay the cost for your cooperation. If you defect, you only get the benefit from my cooperation, you get B. If I defect while you cooperate, you have no benefit from me, you just pay your cost minus C. And if you defect and I defect, we both have zero payoff. So this is the payoff matrix of the prisoner's dilemma. And now we will play this game, and I will ask you, do you want to cooperate or to defect? I have just given you what you would earn in the respective outcomes. And it is a prisoner's dilemma if benefit is greater than cost is greater than zero. So benefit is greater than cost is greater than zero. This is the outcome of the game. Who wants to cooperate with me? Nobody? 1, 2, 3, 4. Who wants to defect? Well, so I should say it's not an optional game. We also have in game theory optional game. There would be a third column, which means do nothing, and that's a very different scenario which we also analyze. So this is a game where you have only two options: cooperate or defect. So who wants to cooperate? Who wants to defect? I think it's about half-half, actually. Maybe even more than half people cooperate. So this is how to analyze the game. You don't know what I will do. Let's assume I cooperate. If I cooperate, you have a choice between getting B minus C for your cooperation or B for your defection. So B is greater than B minus C. So under the assumption I will cooperate, it's better for you to defect. What happens if I defect? You have a choice between 0 and minus C. 0 is greater than minus C. If I defect, it's better for you to defect. No matter what I will do, it's better for you to defect. If I analyze the game in the same rational way, we both end up with defection. And we both have zero payoff. And we are unhappy because we are looking over there where we could have had benefit minus cost greater than 0. The rational outcome of the prisoner's dilemma in classic game theory terms is to defect. But as we have just seen, people like to cooperate in this game. And in classic economic theory, that kind of cooperation is considered irrational. But we will come, as we move through this talk, actually to a good explanation why many of you tried to cooperate in this situation. So in the evolutionary approach to game theory, we don't really rely on this rationality. So this is the dilemma: do rational players defect and end up with a low payoff, 0, but do irrational players might cooperate and receive a higher payoff, B minus C. As I said, in the biological approach, we don't really need to do this type of rationality analysis, but a very different analysis leads to the same conclusion. And this is, we have populations. As I said in the beginning, evolution is always about populations. Now, individuals in this population are either cooperators or defectors. In any mixed population, defector has a higher payoff than cooperator. For the same reason that we analyzed before, because whenever you imagine an interaction with a third random person, the defector has a higher payoff from that person than the cooperator has from this person, no matter what that person is. So in any mixed population, a defector is better off. Natural selection rewards those that are better off. You increase the abundance of defectors until defectors have taken over the population. Natural selection destroys cooperation. And there was no use of this rationality argument in the biological interpretation of the prisoner's dilemma. So natural selection opposes cooperation, and we want to ask the question, how can we help natural selection to favor cooperators over defectors? So natural selection needs help to favor cooperators over defectors. And that help is provided in terms, as I propose, of 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. So I think over the last 40 years, people have written many thousands of papers actually to explain how natural selection can give rise to cooperation. And all these papers can be summarized into into one of these 5 mechanisms. And sometimes people use several of these mechanisms at the same time. But these mechanisms, for me, are the archetypes, how you can get cooperation. So they are interaction structures that allow natural selection to favor cooperation over defection. And I will go through each of them in turn. The first one, kin selection, then direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, and group selection. So kin selection is the idea that interaction occurs between genetic relatives. And G.B.S. Holden, a founding father of population genetics, made the remark, I will jump into the... Is there something here? I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And so the idea here is that the probability that the brother shares the gene with him is 1/2 and the cousin with 1/8. If he risks his life, he wants to have a return in the copy number of genes that he's actually saving. And G.B.S. Holden was not only a founding father of population genetics, he was also politically active. Between the First and the Second World War in the UK, he was a dedicated communist, here addressing a group of British workers, presumably not talking about population genetics. And this was made famous in the PhD thesis of William Hamilton, and that became known as Hamilton's rule. And Hamilton's rule states that the coefficient of relatedness, R, has to be greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio of this altruistic or cooperative act. And this is a mathematical formulation of this idea that Holden proposed. And it explains how you can get cooperation among genetically related individuals. That's the attempt here. It's an attempt to explain how to get cooperation between genetically related individuals. And this particular approach is based on what Hamilton called inclusive fitness theory. And inclusive fitness theory is a specific mathematical method to actually count effects of kin selection. And the debate that was mentioned in the beginning is very much about the explanatory power or the mathematical consistency of this theory. And at the end of my talk, I will actually demonstrate the problems that you have with inclusive fitness theory. But I would like to do this at the end of my talk because I will first discuss the other mechanisms. My position is that it is possible to have a meaningful formulation of kin selection, but it should not rely on inclusive fitness theory. Now I move to the second mechanism, which is a theory how to get cooperation between non-relatives. And it was formulated in a paper by Robert Rivers written in 1971. And the idea is, I help you, you help me. So the idea is there are repeated interactions. And if there are repeated interactions, it can make sense to cooperate. So we move now from a one-shot game to a repeated prisoner's dilemma. And in the repeated prisoner's dilemma, economists can prove what is known the Folk theorem, which says that there's an incentive for a rational player to cooperate in a repeated game. So here's one type of explanation why many of you tried to cooperate in this experiment that we did at the beginning, because your instinct comes from situations where the game is actually repeated. And in repeated games, it makes sense to cooperate. So that theorem doesn't really tell you how to play that game. And how to play that game is a question that was asked by political scientists at Ann Arbor University in the late 1970s, Robert Axelrod. And he said, I want to understand how do I play the repeated prisoner's dilemma. And he said, submit strategies to me they are computer programs. I will pair them up against each other and we will see what is the winning strategy. And in the first tournament he got 14 strategies and they all played against each other 200 times for 200 rounds, each strategy against every other strategy, and then he just added up whoever had the highest number of points in the end. And the surprising thing was that the simplest of all strategies won. So strategies that were submitted there, some of them used Bayesian statistics, some of them tried to use deception, but the simplest program won that tournament, and it was a 3-line computer program submitted by Canadian game theorist Anatol Rappaport, and the 3 lines were, I start with cooperation, and then if you cooperate, I will cooperate, if you defect, I will defect. So I start with cooperation, and then I do whatever you did last round. So maybe without you realizing, I'm holding up a mirror, and you're playing against yourself 1 round removed. And it was very surprising that the simple strategy won, and Axelrod published the outcome of this tournament and said, now we have seen it, let's do it again. So now many people were interested in submitting strategies that were better than tit for tat, because they couldn't believe that such a strategy should actually win that game. John Maynard Smith submitted a strategy actually. Only one person submitted tit for tat again. Now he had 63 strategies playing against each other. And the amazing thing is tit for tat won again. So tit for tat also won the second tournament, even though many people had designed strategies that were supposedly better than tit for tat. So by that time, tit for tat was a world champion in the repeated prisoner's dilemma. There was one Achilles heel that was known, and the Achilles that was pointed out, I think by maybe a Swedish economist, and this is errors destroy cooperation. Tit for tat is actually unforgiving. If 2 tit for tat players play against each other and one makes a mistake and defects, the other one will retaliate. A further defection can lead to full-blown defection, another mistake to full-blown defection. In the long run, 2 tit for tat players perform as poorly as flipping a coin on every round. So tit for tat does not have a way to cope with errors that are realistic in the real world. And economists call these errors, they distinguish between 2 sources of errors. One is called trembling hand, and the other one is called fuzzy mind. And these are natural properties of agents that you would expect to have to deal with if you want to apply your theory in the real world. So when I started my PhD thesis in Vienna with Carl Sigmund, we had the following idea: let natural selection design a strategy to play the repeated prisoner's dilemma. We start with a random ensemble of strategies and observe that at first always defect is emerging as a kind of winning strategy. If people just play randomly disorganized, the best thing or the only thing you can do is to defect all the time. But fortunately for my PhD thesis, the computer simulation didn't end here. Something very surprising happened. After a short time, tit for tat came about. Tit for tat came about and initiated this movement from always defect society to a kind of cooperative society. Later, we were actually able to prove that tit for tat is the perfect catalyst for initiating the first rounds of cooperation in a society where almost everybody is a defector. But then again, surprising, tit for tat was not here to stay. Tit for tat was very quickly replaced by another strategy. So tit for tat really was like a catalyst. It came and it went, and the chemical reaction was sort of left unaffected. It moved to generous tit for tat. And generous tit for tat is a strategy that works in the following way. I start with cooperation, and then if you cooperate, I will cooperate. But if you defect, I will cooperate with a certain probability. So it's a probabilistic way to actually find back to cooperation. And you can calculate the maximum probability such that you're not exploited by always defect. And in some sense, it's a model for the evolution of forgiveness. Because what is promoted by natural selection here is a strategy that can forgive occasional mistakes. It's also a recipe that I think would save many marriages, because you would have dice on the kitchen counter and you would roll the dice to decide to cooperate, to forgive in certain situations, and there's no need for a divorce. So the interesting thing is it also didn't end here. Something else happened. And this is after some time you moved from generous tit for tat to always cooperate. The society became more and more lenient, more and more cooperative, until nobody had any kind of reciprocity in that system. So if you think about it like this, if everybody here plays generous tit for tat, and I play unconditional cooperation, I'm a neutral mutant. Nobody exploits me, I'm as fit as everybody else. It is random drift. Random drift moves you from generous tit for tat to always cooperate. If a biological trait is not under pressure, it is actually not being maintained. If birds go to an island without predators, they might lose the ability to fly. So random drift makes the population actually too cooperative. Once you're down here, you can bet what happens next. You invite always the fact that you have a little mathematical theory of human history. You have oscillations between cooperation and defection. And that was actually my first paper on that topic, and ever since, this is what we find. We always find oscillations in the evolution of cooperation. We never find cooperation to be fully stable, to be just an equilibrium, a final state. And for me, this is also so interesting because economists often ask the question of equilibrium. And in this big part of strategy, so typically it is not about equilibrium. It is not about equilibrium, it's always about dynamic, and how much cooperation you have in a society on average depends how long you can maintain the cooperative state and how quickly you are when you want to rebuild the cooperative state. And that is almost the more important aspect of it. How quickly can you rebuild cooperation once it has broken down? And you can apply this also to like financial cycles of up and down, where people want to build a new system that is fail-proof, where people cooperate, that it works for some time, then people have found a way to get around it, then it breaks down, then you have to build another system. So direct reciprocity is open-ended. There are also other strategies like win-stay-lose shift. You can also play the game alternatingly instead of simultaneously. It's like playing chess. Nobody knows how to play the perfect strategy in chess. There's also no way to play the perfect way for direct reciprocity. But it's one simple rule, and this simple rule is that direct reciprocity allows the evolution of cooperation if the probability for another round is greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio. If W is greater than C over B, then you have a chance that direct reciprocity can give rise to cooperation. So you need to have sufficiently many rounds in comparison with the cost-to-benefit ratio in order to get cooperation by direct reciprocity. So that was the second mechanism, and after each mechanism I try to come up with a simple rule that in some sense characterizes the mechanism. The third mechanism is indirect reciprocity. So whatever the motivation of the Good Samaritan was, it was presumably not that he was thinking this is the first round of a repeated prisoner's dilemma and one cooperates in the first round of a repeated prisoner's dilemma. So in indirect reciprocity, the idea is I help you and somebody will help me. And I think it's a very natural way how people think, how people act, and the question is how can you make it work? How can that become a mechanism for the evolution of cooperation? And the way how you make it work is with reputation. So the donor pays a cost, the recipient gets a benefit, and then the reputation of the donor increases. Or the donor avoids the cost, the donor defects, no benefit, but the reputation goes down. And in mathematical analysis and in computer simulations, you can actually show that this gives rise to strategies that cooperate with others that have good reputation. So this could also be an explanation why more than half of you cooperated in this instance, because reputation is important and you want to be seen as a cooperator. The experimental confirmation of this, there was an experiment done by Manfred Milinski and Klaus Wedekind, published in Science in 2000, where they had students sitting in front of computer screens and they were asked the question, do you want to donate $1 for another student to have $4? That student has done the following action in previous rounds. And then it turned out, not surprisingly, that people help those who help others, and helpful people have a higher payoff in the end. The idea is that indirect reciprocity is very much linked to gossip. Gossip spreads reputation. So there's an interaction between two individuals, A helps B. Some observe the interaction, and then the others are informed about the interaction. So I would argue that humans are obsessed in gossip to talk about other people, to find out about the reputation of other people and how they would interact with them. There was an experiment actually done in British trains where they listened to people's conversation to classify 60% of them, 60% of the conversation topic fell within indirect reciprocity evaluations of others. So these games of indirect reciprocity are cognitively demanding. The individuals need to monitor the social network of the group. They need to understand what is going on, between whom, who is doing what to whom and why. So this leads to a kind of selection for evolution of social intelligence. And to have this indirect reciprocity where you actually talk to others about others, you need language. So this is the right selection pressure for human language. And so I would argue that indirect reciprocity played a crucial role in the evolution of the human language. And the way to understand it is actually to have models for the co-evolution between indirect reciprocity and human language. So my friend David Haig at Harvard put it like this: for direct reciprocity you need a face, for indirect reciprocity you need a name. And I find this a beautiful summary because there's a lot in faces. There's a lot in the cognitive task that actually enables the brain to recognize faces, to interpret faces, to read intention into faces. And all of this is actually needed should you play repeated games simultaneously with others in the population. You have to recognize them. You have to remember what they did last time. But for indirect reciprocity, that's actually not enough. For indirect reciprocity, you have to be able to talk to somebody about somebody else. You need a name. And as much as we know about animal communication, I don't think we have any example that non-human animals have actually this ability of naming. That would be a very interesting discussion. And indirect reciprocity is actually harder to calculate than direct reciprocity because we have an assessment rule and we have an action rule. But again, there's one simple kind of summary of this mechanism for the evolution of cooperation, and this is indirect reciprocity works if the probability to know someone's reputation is greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio. So you have to be in a society where there's a significant fraction of people that you actually know for this to work. And then it can also work with strangers, because I could help strangers because this benefits my reputation that I have in front of my friends. So this was the third mechanism for the evolution of cooperation. And now I'm coming to the fourth mechanism, and this is what I call spatial selection. And in spatial selection, I will briefly discuss spatial games, games on graphs, games in phenotype space, and games on sets. And many models of evolution assume a so-called well-mixed population where everybody interacts with everybody else equally likely. But evolution behaves differently if the population has a structure. And if the population has a spatial structure, then cooperation can actually come about because cooperators can form clusters in the contest with defectors. And so the idea here would be neighbors help each other. And if you just have the rule that you help your neighbor as a cooperator, then that forms a cluster, and these clusters can survive in a world of defectors. And that gives rise to interesting mathematical structures if you play the game deterministically, at least, so deterministic cellular automata that have some features. And that's work that I did with Robert May now about 20 years ago, where cooperators in blue can actually invade a world of defectors in red, and yellow and green cells in this automaton that have just changed from either cooperation to defection or defection to cooperation. And there are a few things that could be calculated here, such as the average amount of cooperators in here is 12 times logarithm 2 minus 8. But other than this, there was not much in terms of mathematical characterization of these spatial games until about 2006. So in 2005, we started to work on what we called games on graphs. So here the individuals are now part of a network. So this is a generalization of this regular lattice approach that we did in spatial games. And that graph structure can describe a spatial structure or a social network. And the principle remains the same, that cooperators can form clusters, and these clusters can survive in the competition with defectors. And the idea here is that each cooperator pays a cost for every neighbor, and each individual gets a benefit from each cooperator who is a neighbor. And so you assign payoffs to all of these individuals, and then you have an evolutionary update rule, and that evolutionary update rule can promote cooperation without any strategic complexity. So the interesting thing of this approach here is that you don't need conditional behavior. Unconditional cooperation can be promoted in a structured population. It was very surprising for us that a Japanese postdoc of mine proved the simplest possible rule that exists in this world that we didn't discover like in the 20 years before, and this is that spatial selection on graphs favors cooperation if benefit over cost is greater than the average number of neighbors. And this is a result that actually makes the assumption of weak selection, and this is everybody has approximately the same fitness, and the game is only a small perturbation of this average fitness. These were computer simulations done by Christoph Howard of Switzerland, where we actually demonstrated this simple rule for a large number of different structures and found agreement between the theory and the numerical experiments. Another version of this is games in phenotype space, or sometimes people call it tag-based cooperation, where the strategy is just you cooperate with somebody who is similar to you. If the strategies cooperate with those who are similar, you can have a cluster formation in this space of similarity, which also allows evolution of cooperation. And also at about this time, we proposed something that we call evolutionary set theory. So people belong to sets, and people interact with others in the same set, and then people adopt the strategy and set membership of successful individuals. So in game theory, you just imitate the strategy of somebody else. In this here, you imitate the strategy of somebody else, and you want to join the club or the group that this person is actually in. And that leads to an interesting phenomenon, because successful groups attract more members. So for example, you find out about a research group, you go to this research group, you see how the people are doing there, you want to join that group in order to thrive also. And so this is another way how you get the clustering, such that spatial selection in a space that has to do with groupings in human society can actually promote cooperation. This was the fourth mechanism, and now the last mechanism, group selection. There can be no doubt that a tribe, here's a quote from Charles Darwin, The Descent of Man, 1871, there can be no doubt that a tribe, including many members, who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over other tribes, and this would be natural selection. It's a beautiful quote. He thinks of a competition between two different tribes. In one tribe people help each other, in the other tribe they don't. And his natural selection will promote one over the other. He has no problem here to call this natural selection. I think he also wasn't really aware of the intricacies in a mathematical sense of the conflict between individual selection in a group to favor defectors, and then against this, the selection between groups to actually favor cooperators. You might have heard of this example of the New York subway hero who actually jumped down in order to... So if there was a man who had a seizure and he fell onto the tracks, and another man stood there with his daughters on the way to school and saw this situation. And the train, the headlights of the oncoming train were already visible. And this person jumped down to save this person who was on the tracks down there. And then realized there's not enough time for me to get him out again. So he held him down and he put himself over it, and the train passed over both of them. And this was then, and both of them survived unharmed. This was the New York subway hero who was then rewarded by Mayor Bloomberg of New York, and described in many newspapers. I think very few of us would have the possibility to act in this heroic way. But I would argue all of us would feel extremely disconcerted to witness such a situation. So if somebody bad happens to somebody, all of us feel I have to do something. If somebody falls in front of me in the street, I want to rush there to help the person up. And you have to ask yourself the question, why do we have this instinct? It feels almost like a spinal reflex. And one way to explain such an instinct would be typically that happens in the context of my group. And if in my group, people do this, then the group is more successful than a group where it doesn't work out like this. So group selection is very controversial, but it does work if you calculate it precisely. So one simple way to get group selection is you play the game with others in your group. The offspring are added to the groups divide when reaching a certain size, and the groups die. So here's a simple evolutionary model that can be precisely formulated. And in that model, what you have, as opposed to the previous model, is that you have this, in addition to individuals competing in the group, you have a competition between groups. Because when groups get too big, they kind of split, and the total number of groups is conserved. And in such a model, you can prove that group selection favors cooperation if the benefit over cost ratio is greater than 1 plus, and now you have the group size over the number of groups. So group selection works well if you have a large number of small groups. And if you're worried about people moving between groups, we call this migration, then this appears as an extra term in this calculation. So there would be another term where you have the migration rate. If the migration rate gets too big, obviously you destroy the propensity of group selection, because then the structure is too fluid. But for any migration rate, there would be a benefit to cost ratio that would make it work. So I discussed 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation: kin selection, and here the idea is you cooperate with genetic relatives. Direct reciprocity, I help you, you help me. Indirect reciprocity, I help you, somebody helps me. Spatial selection is neighbors help each other. Group selection is groups of cooperators outcompete other groups. And each of these mechanisms, I described a simple equation that captures some essential feature of this. And in all of these cases, the benefit to cost ratio is compared with a key quantity that is the coefficient of relatedness in kin selection, the probability of another round in direct reciprocity, the probability to know the reputation of somebody in indirect reciprocity, the number of neighbors in terms of games and graphs for spatial selection, and then a ratio of group size over number of groups. So 5 mechanisms, and a mechanism is an interaction structure that explains how the individuals of a population interact. 5 mechanisms that allow evolution of cooperation. And now we come to the controversy. The controversy is with respect to the mathematical theory that has been developed and was the standard way to explain kin selection in the last 40 years. So this is a paper that was a collaboration with E.O. Wilson and Corina Tarnitzer, and the title was The Evolution of Eusociality, and it was published in Nature in 2010. And in this paper we show inclusive fitness theory rests on limiting assumptions. So for inclusive fitness theory to work, the evolutionary process has to fulfill some limiting assumption. Inclusive fitness theory is actually not needed to explain the evolution of eusociality. So if you want to understand why there are eusocial insects, it is sufficient to have a standard population genetics natural selection analysis. You don't need to evoke the concept of inclusive fitness. That was a surprise for me, actually. And that was also a surprise. Once fitness is calculated, every aspect of genetic relatedness is included. So if I have a correct calculation of fitness, I have included every aspect of genetic relatedness in my population. And so how does it work? What is inclusive fitness? Inclusive fitness is precisely defined by Hamilton in the famous 1964 paper. Inclusive fitness may be imagined as the personal fitness which an individual actually expresses in its production of adult offspring as it becomes after it has been first stripped and then augmented in a certain way. It is stripped of all components which can be considered as due to the individual's social environment, leaving the fitness which he would express if not exposed to any of the harms or benefits of that environment. This quantity is then augmented by certain fractions of the quantities of harm and benefit which the individual himself causes to the fitness of his neighbors. So the important thing here is that we have personal fitness, and in red I highlight these words stripped and augmented. So we have to take the personal fitness of an individual, but then take away what is due to the social environment, and then add what is the effect of this on others. So the fundamental assumption of this theory is that personal fitness can be written down as a sum of additive components. And this is precisely it's very easy to prove that this sometimes works, but for the majority of evolutionary processes, it does not work. So if you illustrate it, there is what I call the standard approach. The standard approach would be that you have an interaction between two individuals in a population. You calculate the consequence of this interaction. It leads to a payoff, it leads to fitness, it leads to reproduction. This is like the normal way that is done by population genetics and by evolutionary game theory. And the inclusive fitness method is the following. I take only one action, and I ask now, what is the effect of this action on the actor's fitness? And then I add to this the effect of this action on the fitness of others times relatedness. Most people believe inclusive fitness is my fitness plus your fitness times relatedness. That's not true, and Hamilton knew that that wouldn't work. Instead, for inclusive fitness to actually work, you have to split it as proposed by Hamilton. And so as a theoretician, you look at this and you see, that's interesting, but I have to ask the question, when can I do that? Because it is not a priori the case that I always can do it. I cannot expect that fitness is always an additive function of individual actions. So a simple example is, if we come back to Haldane, I will jump into the river to save two brothers. So if suppose you're jumping into the river to save somebody, and a year later that same person needs to be saved again, so somebody else has to jump again, this person is saved by the action of two people, but it's not additive, because if one of them wouldn't have jumped, the person wouldn't have been saved. That's like a simple metaphoric example to show that in most cases we are not in an additive situation. So it is completely clear. So here we just don't need to subdivide fitness into additive components. We take personal fitness as is, and that is the subject of our calculation. Here we must subdivide fitness into additive components. And that is sometimes possible, and we give many examples in our paper when you can do that, but we also show when you cannot do that. So the two approaches are not equivalent because in general it is not possible to decompose fitness into additive components caused by individual actions. And that's actually the end. That's all that needs to be said, that inclusive fitness theory is not a general description of evolution, but a description of evolution that works sometimes, but not always. There's something more that is interesting. So the inclusive fitness theory applies to a subset of evolutionary processes. However, if inclusive fitness theory can be calculated, it gives the same result as the normal calculation. So it is not that the inclusive fitness calculation gives you another insight. It gives the same result at best if it is used properly and if you are in a situation where it can be calculated. Therefore, there is no distinct prediction of inclusive fitness theory that could have been tested empirically. So it is not possible on logical grounds that inclusive fitness theory can make a prediction that is different from standard natural selection that an empiricist can actually go out there and measure. And again, as I said, once fitness is calculated, every effect of genetic relatedness is included. So to demonstrate again what the different approaches are, if you want to go back to Haldane, you want to calculate the normal, the standard population genetics way. Gene A, jump into the river if you see your brother. Gene B, never jump. Which gene is favored by natural selection? That's the question. That's a population genetics question. On the level of the gene, there is no inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness comes only into play if you don't want to do it like this. Instead, you want to do it like this. How does jumping into the river affect Haldane's inclusive fitness? So inclusive fitness comes about when you want to maintain the level of individual as the analysis. But if you really go to genes, so if you really have a genetic approach to evolution, genes don't have inclusive fitness. Individuals have inclusive fitness. Something else I would like to add, that inclusive fitness is not simple, because sometimes people say it's a simpler way to do it, but that's not the case, because for inclusive fitness calculation you also have to take into account the competition you have with other individuals that are actually not either the recipients or donors of the action right now. So for example, here's my cousin, and I'm jumping into the river to save my cousin, but my cousin is competing with my brother for the same woman. So by increasing the fitness of my cousin, I have now harmed the fitness of my brother. I have to take this into account in the inclusive fitness calculation. Inclusive fitness theorists know this, but it means that the inclusive fitness calculation becomes as complicated as just a normal calculation. It's not that you can do a shortcut here. And then one of the things that is also explained in our paper, Hamilton's rule almost never holds. And by this, we mean the following. So Hamilton's rule says benefit times related is greater than cost. If benefit and cost, if B and C are actually the benefit and the cost of individual actions or properties of individual phenotypes, then in very simple models, even in a model where inclusive fitness calculation is possible, that is not the outcome. So you can calculate a one-dimensional spatial model where I can help the neighbor at a cost C, exactly as we discussed it, minus C plus B, and Hamilton's rule would not be the outcome for that model. In order to make Hamilton's rule work, you actually have to introduce generalizations. This is what we now call generalizations of Hamilton's rule, but here you make the benefit something that is dependent on the population structure, dependent on the relatedness. So here we are moving into a very nebulous mathematics where the quantities that are being used are actually no longer meaningful in terms of the theory. And that doesn't really help you in order to solve any particular evolutionary problem. It also doesn't help the empiricist to measure anything out there and learn what to conclude from this experiment to actually the next experiment. So this is not the main argument, but the side argument is what is the value of Hamilton's rule, and what I have observed in the field is inclusive fitness theorists like to say Hamilton's rule always holds. The problem is only what do I have to call benefit and cost in order to make it work. But mathematically, that's not a reasonable approach. So then you don't actually have a productive theory. Because a productive theory would be that I have a rule that tells me how to solve a problem. And this is not a rule that tells you how to solve a problem. It's actually first you have to solve the problem, and then you can take the solution for the problem to kind of try to write it in that way. And this is how inclusive fitness theory is actually used in most cases, rewriting the final answer for an evolutionary calculation. So I still think kin selection is meaningful, is a meaningful mechanism for evolution if we formulate it in terms of conditional behavior based on kin recognition. So what I would like to see is actually a theory that takes into account that I recognize the other individual as kin or non-kin and behave accordingly. And that works as a mechanism for evolution of cooperation, I suppose. But inclusive fitness theory is not a useful approach to study kin selection. So what I wish to develop is a theory for kin selection that does not use inclusive fitness. As I have illustrated here with Hope and saying they are based on the genes, for example. So I want to add on a positive note, however, to say that winning strategies of direct and indirect reciprocity are actually generous, hopeful, and forgiving. And by this, I mean the following properties. Forgiving we already saw. Generous did for that is a forgiving strategy. In order to do well, you have to forgive mistakes. Hopeful means if I meet a new person, I start with cooperation. I have the hope I can establish cooperation with a stranger. If you don't have that property, you're not a winning strategy. Generous means the following thing. If you think of tit for tat or generous tit for tat or strategy of indirect reciprocity, they never win a game. The amazing thing is, tit for tat never wins a game in the sense it never has more than the other person. At best, it has as much as the other person. So I have many near draws, and that is good enough. And that is actually a very important message for society. I think people are overly competitive. They often judge situations as, I have to win. If I don't win, I'm out. It's like the Wimbledon tournament. But in reality, I just have to find a good compromise. I will make many good compromises. And overall, that makes you win. So I thank all the cooperators with whom I worked on this topic. And I some of these ideas are also described in this book, Super Cooperators. Thank you very much.
So, time for one or two questions before our guests have to leave.
So do you think some of the critiques of the 2010 paper derive from a confusion between an objection to the application of inclusiveness itself with the whole concept of kin selection?
I mean, some of the letters, they say that what we are saying is that genetic relatedness is completely unimportant. That's not what we are saying. Genetic relatedness is an aspect of population structure, and population structure is very important to understand the evolutionary process. But partly what I want to say is arguments that are based on genetic relatedness alone are never the whole story.
So is that why there's so much fury about the critique of this theory? That it comes ideologically freighted? It's a threat to the genetic obsession, you might say, of a certain kind of theorizing. Is there more at stake here than maths, in other words?
No, I think the social phenomenon is that inclusive fitness theory is often used as a kind of substitute for an actual calculation. So people in evolution like to do calculations, but a straightforward population-based calculation is usually too complicated for most people. So they think they can do a shortcut by embracing a framework that seems simpler to them. But the framework actually isn't simpler if you really do it. So I think that inclusive fitness was presented over the years as something that is so simple that everybody could do it. But this is where it's very misleading. Because if you have an actual field situation and you want to do an inclusive fitness calculation, that would be enormously complicated.
I wonder what kind of assumptions go into your work about fertility rates and what happens in a society like, say, South Korea that experiences in a very short time a precipitous drop in fertility rates with many, many people not having children. Many people, in fact, many families perhaps not seeing their genes carrying on. This is a huge change in that society. It's also extremely insular. So when you're looking around the world and you're looking at these kinds of changes in fertility rates, does that challenge any of the assumptions of your models in terms of what you would expect from cooperativity among people in a group with low fertility?
So I have not worked on this. I have considered it's an interesting problem, a potential problem for research, and this is the trade-off between genetic reproduction and cultural reproduction. So people have the possibility to reproduce genetically or culturally in some sense. They have certain goals, they have certain agendas. They want to replicate these goals and agendas. And I feel that leads to a trade-off. And so that can lead to people who want to concentrate on the cultural success as opposed to the genetic success. And this is, I think, what we are seeing. And I've not worked on this, but this is an interesting possibility.
It's an assumption of Prison's dilemma theory that defectors do better than cooperators when the individual you're working with cooperates. But in many circumstances, it's likely to be the case that if one individual defects, both individuals lose substantially, which is the Prison's delight situation. So my impression is that quite a lot of real animal circumstances actually resemble Prison's delights rather than Prison's dilemmas. I realise those are less interesting to a theoretician because the answer perhaps is more obvious. But am I right in thinking that where you have Prison's delight, where cooperation is just the best outcome for both individuals, you wouldn't call that cooperation?
So actually, what I call cooperation is, I don't have a blackboard here, but there would be a payoff matrix, and in that payoff matrix you have 4 entries. And let's call them R for mutual cooperation, and P for mutual defection, T for the temptation that the defector has, and S for the sucker's payoff. That's the standard way to do it. So to talk about cooperation, you want to have the property that 2 cooperators have more than 2 defectors. So R greater than P. Otherwise, that wouldn't be cooperation. So cooperation is the better thing if both do it. And now to have a cooperative dilemma, you need some incentive to defect. And so now there can be 3 incentives to defect that I list actually in my papers, and one is that it is better to defect against a cooperator than to cooperate with a cooperator. The second one is it's better to defect against a defector than to cooperate with a defector. The third one is, in a cooperator-defector pair, I want to be the defector. These are 3 incentives. If all incentives hold, we're in the world of prisoner's dilemma. If one of the incentives holds, we still have a cooperative dilemma, but a relaxed one. I think many animal situations are relaxed cooperative dilemmas. If none of the incentives hold, we don't have a dilemma. My theories always work for any payoff matrix. So my theory is I'm not married to the prisoner's dilemma. But the prisoner's dilemma is somehow the cleanest game to study because without a mechanism you don't get any cooperation at all. In the relaxed cases you get some cooperation even without a mechanism. But a mechanism would give you more cooperation.
I don't dispute that. I mean, I just come back to the point that in many cases the solution is probably cooperate or die.
Yeah, I would like to study this together with you.
Thank you. Maybe time for one last one, because we have to let Professor Nowak go shortly. Yeah, Professor Newsom's got his question back.
It was a question about reputation. You know, the situation in which reputation is so important, people gossiping, and it's more important to have a name than a face. Are there any aspects of your models that track the success of introverts versus extroverts in a reputation society? And can you quantify that? And can you actually look for data out there in social networking sites like Facebook and the mechanisms for producing one's reputation and promoting it?
Mm-hmm. So the 2 components of the question. One is, yes, these reputation mechanisms are very much what also inspire internet trading. And people have written many papers on this phenomenon, but you're willing to pay a higher price if the seller has a good reputation. And the other things, introvert and extroverts, yes, we study evolutionary update mechanisms in the learning scenario of cultural evolution. And one way to update your strategy would be to just look at your own payoff and try to improve. And we call this introvert. And another one is that I look at others, what others are actually doing, and try to learn from them. And we call this extrovert. And even though we don't have a complete result yet there, it seems to us that these extrovert learners are more likely to find cooperation than just the introvert learners. But these various different ways of learning in the cultural context is something that is under active research at the moment.
Well, that's fascinating. I think we probably ought to draw things to a close, just to give you a chance to get on to your next engagement. So, thank you very, very much indeed for a brilliant lecture.